Back with me, Nola Haynes, Malcolm Nance, and Jason Johnson. Listen, we have been breaking news all hour. We did get that guidance from the State Department that everyone in America or everyone in Russia, every American in Russia needs to leave immediately. I'm going to bring in Josh Lederman now, our reporter. He's coming to us from Brussels. He's going to join us by the phone and talk us through this. Josh, thanks so much for hustling to get with us. Why the urgency of this guidance from the State Department now? Walk us through what you're hearing.
Well, we should point out, first of all, Tiffany, that the U.S. government has been urging Americans for weeks now to consider leaving Russia. So a part of this, it builds on what the U.S. has been saying for some time, that there are risks right now to Americans who are remaining in Russia and that it could become more and more difficult to get out. But the previous travel warnings from the State Department used language that said Americans should consider leaving, should urgently look for options to get out of the country that do not involve the assistance of the U.S. government. Today, this updated travel warning is significantly strengthening that language. There's no consider, there's no look into. The U.S. government saying now U.S. citizens who are in Russia should leave immediately. And part of what they are looking at is not only the fact that given that the U.S. and the EU have now banned Russian airplanes from their airspace and vice versa, meaning that it's more difficult to get out of a flight out, but also the fact that the U.S. has a diminished diplomatic presence in the country right now as a result of the mutual rejections, evictions, we call it persona non grata, but essentially kicking out each other's diplomats means that there's not as many U.S. diplomats on the ground right now in Russia who are able to assist U.S. citizens should they get into trouble, should they need help leaving the country, or should they have something happen to them in Russia and need consular assistance. If under international law, if an American citizen were to be detained in Russia, for example, the Russians would be expected to provide consular access, meaning a U.S. diplomat would be able to go visit them, help them to a certain degree to coordinate legal services or other help that they might need. But that is a diminished capacity that the U.S. government has right now. And this builds on reporting that we put out at NBC News a few days ago saying that several U.S. officials were telling us that the U.S. government was very concerned about the possibility that Russia could detain U.S. citizens who are in Russia as a response and retaliation for U.S. sanctions and stepped up pressure, particularly that there was a concern that they could detain U.S. business people who are operating in the country who comply with those U.S. sanctions. So that increases the urgency for the U.S. government in wanting to make sure Americans there get out while they still can. The State Department saying in that most recent travel warning just a few minutes ago that limited commercial flight options are still available. Those, of course, are not direct flights to the U.S. They're not direct flights to the EU, but ostensibly people in Russia could still fly via Dubai, via Tel Aviv, other regional transportation hubs, and then make their way to the U.S. or somewhere else. The government at this point saying that Americans should find their way to any country other than Russia. Tiffany.
That's quite frightening, Josh. I know you've been reporting, but I do want to draw your attention to, we just brought breaking news last segment. Brittany Griner, she's a WNBA player. She has been detained by Russian authorities there. According to the reporting, she had some a hash, essentially, I believe a hash cartridge filled with oil. So what you're saying is compounding with what we're hearing about her being detained there as well. So as I understand it, there will be no assistance to help the Americans flee Russia, if that's what you're saying.
Not exactly. The remaining U.S. diplomats who are working in Russia, as well as their colleagues who are outside of Russia, who are in neighboring countries or who are at the State Department in Washington, are still going to do everything they can to help Americans. But the State Department is warning that their ability to do that is severely limited and is diminishing. So that means that even if the State Department and its diplomats want to help and try to help, they may not be able to provide the kinds of assistance to Americans who either want to leave or who get into some type of an issue in Russia that they would under normal circumstances.
And Josh, I just want to be clear, because I know that you were saying before that there was encouragement, strong encouragement to leave. The stark contrast today is to leave immediately. I know you spoke a lot about it before, but is there something, a major thing that happened that prompted this change in guidance?
Well, we don't know exactly, but I think that the signs have been mounting that there are increasing concerns about Americans in Russia. Most recently, there was the announcement in Russia that that journalists who report in a way that the Russian government doesn't feel is factual could be subjected to up to 15 years in prison. We heard from the Russian top diplomat Sergei Lavrov today saying that that law needs to be implemented. They need to actually act on that law. So that speaks directly to the kind of growing reasons that the U.S. government is seeing to be able to now make this recommendation that all American citizens who are in the country should leave.
Quite frightening, Josh. We will definitely keep our eye on this. Before I let you go, just one quick question. You know, we have a lot of journalists across the country in Russia helping to bring this very important story. There's a lot of protests happening in Russia, over 100 protests in different Russian cities, including President Vladimir Putin's home city of St. Petersburg. What does this mean for journalists who are there helping to tell these important stories?
Well, all I can say is that, you know, there is that new law that we discussed that certainly has caused some concern. And we know that a number of Western news organizations, such as the BBC and others, have announced that temporarily they will not be broadcasting out of Russia while they examine this new law and the implications for it.
Josh, thanks so much for bringing all this breaking news to us. This is quite the developing story. We will definitely keep our eye on it all morning, and we're going to bring in our panel into this discussion now to talk about what the great reporting that Josh just informed us. Malcolm, I want to turn to you on this because this is your lane, my friend. You are such a value to this network right now. Walk us through what you just heard Josh say. What does this mean for Americans who are still there?
Well, you know, there are generally tens of thousands of Americans who are working overseas or who may be dual national citizens. We saw this problem with Afghanistan. We tried to get out every one of the American citizens. There were many who didn't want to leave. This is the exact same circumstance. We do have limited consular capability. We tend to rely on other embassies who might have diplomatic relations. I don't know whether this is a run-up to a complete and total diplomatic break with Russia. I mean, it seems very dire the way that they're putting it. But again, like we saw with the WNBA player, this is a circumstance that Russia can exploit through a hostile government detention. By the way, can I make a quick point about that? By arresting an African-American woman, the charge she's going to be done with is they're going to try to zip her up as a U.S. drug dealer bringing drugs, Africans bringing drugs into Russia. And they are going to get her to confess to something, and it's going to hurt. And it's going to hurt every other citizen who remains inside of Russia. So people, if you can leave, leave.
Very, very frightening indeed. Nola, this is also your lane. Happy to have you here this morning. What's your take on this latest guidance out of Russia? The new law in Russia that, you know, protesting could lead to 10 to 15 years in prison, yet the people persist. They're still protesting. What does that say about what's happening on ground there?
The first thing that it tells me is that the Russian people didn't want this. The Russian people didn't want to wake up to war. And now we really are in a situation where things are escalating. As I'm watching the footage, as I'm listening to the on-ground reporting, the only thing that I could think of is we're going to be doing this for a while. I just got really scared and really nervous because this has really changed the calculus. You are now detaining Americans. And then, like I said, my worry is, like Malcolm just said, that Brittany will be exploited. And the way that it's going to reverberate back here, people are going to want the U.S. president to do something to get her out of there. And it's going to cause more friction, more internal friction here. So in terms of strategy, I'm seeing how this is going to play out, and I am getting nervous. This woman will be exploited. And not to mention the other Americans who were there, but her race and her gender has a lot to do with it. And I am just really nervous for where this is going to go. And one of the things that I definitely want to implore is that right now, America, we need to be more united than ever, because the way that these campaigns are going to work against us, we've seen it happen time after time after time. But right now, it's just gotten really, really serious. And right now, division is not what we need.
I completely agree, Jason. Something that makes me very nervous about all of this happening is I wonder what it will take to have direct engagement from the U.S. government. They have one of our citizens. They're saying Americans leave. What does this mean for us domestically?
Well, you remember a couple years ago, you had one of the Ball sons get caught up in something in China.
Yeah, that's right.
And supposedly you had this situation back and forth, and Donald Trump tried to take credit for it, et cetera, et cetera. This might be an instance where the President of the United States has to make a particular call. But I want to add to this, because I think this is important. There's just a practical issue here. Have you ever tried to leave town at the last minute? In the United States, that's not easy.
Yeah.
This isn't cheap, right? We're talking about price inflation. We're talking about $600-700 to get in an Uber. This is not going to be easy for the Americans who want to leave. Not everybody there is rich. And I want to also say this. When we talk about exploitation, we talk about how people are treated by different kinds of government. Brittany Griner isn't just a black woman. She isn't just a WNBA player. She is a queer woman. And we know the kinds of issues and how the LGBTQ community is treated in Russia. This is, we don't know if she's there with her spouse or anything else like that, but this could be a very, very, very difficult situation, and one that probably would require the United States to get involved. So, and it's not going to be the last story like this. There will be other people from local towns. There's going to be somebody in Houston, there's somebody in Austin, and everything else like that, screaming, going on Facebook saying, I need to get out of here. We don't know how this is going to work now, and it's going to be a very, very dangerous and very touchy situation for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And Malcolm, I think, something that all of us are wondering right now, and I don't want to be hyperbolic here. This is a very serious situation, but it does at times feel like we are watching the beginning of the next world war, because if they're detaining American citizens, if American lives are cost, I just wonder from your excellent perspective what it would take for the United States to have direct engagement beyond just arming the Ukrainians, but potentially having boots on the ground.
Well, boots on the ground isn't the issue. I spoke to the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. He says he doesn't want boots on the ground. He wants weapons. And so we need to give them as many weapons as they can carry, as many as we can make fall off a truck at the Polish-Ukrainian border, and let them fight their war. I think this is an escalation by Russia, knowing that it is designed to damage Joe Biden with the Republican Party. And again, the exploitation of this player, because she is queer, because she's black, because she's a basketball player, but most importantly, because she's American, is designed to be a hostage situation. And again, if she confesses to anything, even no matter how small, they're going to bang her up for 10, 15 years, because that's the game that's being played right now. So again, anybody has a phone call to her, make sure that she says not one word to nobody except, I need diplomatic representation and can I have food?
But is that enough, Malcolm? I mean, I kind of feel like, if Putin is willing to commit war crimes, are they going to honor her saying, hey, I have nothing to say, I want to speak to an American representative? I don't know that that's a path to safety for her.
Unfortunately, I mean, it's all she has. It's the only tool that's out there. It's a diplomatic treaty that's been signed for over 200 years. She's allowed representation of her government or someone that represents her government. Again, in Russian system of government, if you confess to anything, you are guilty of that crime. No trial, no nothing. So this is done deliberately to put Joe Biden into a bind, and he's not going to be able to negotiate her out. We'll get the Swiss to try to do it, but the Russians are going to want something quick so that they can exploit it for internal consumption.
That's quite frightening. Jason, I think something that Congressman Ted Lieu brought up last hour is something that we cannot take lightly, and that is Russia is a nuclear power.
Yes.
So direct engagement is very frightening. There's a great line from the film Crimson Tide with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman where he says at the end of the day, nuclear war serves itself because there are no winners there. Right. What are we looking at here?
I don't want to see that at all. And in fact, I think that keeping people from being able to move freely is part of the issue that we've got here. I'll tell you this, Joe Biden may or may not be able to do anything immediately, but you know who's the senator from the state that Brittany Griner's from? Kristen Sinema. Maybe she should step up and say something. Maybe the Arizona senators have something to say about a queer black woman who's being held overseas on possibly trumped up charges. I want to see peace like most Americans do. I don't want to see boots on the ground, to be perfectly candid with you, because I think that's dangerous for everybody. But what I do hope is that we can find some sort of diplomatic diplomatic solution. Even though Vladimir Putin is beating his chest right now, he doesn't want to see these sanctions continue. The oligarchs behind him don't want to see these sanctions continue. I hope that we can find a peaceful solution. I don't want to see any death on either side.
Yeah, you know, something about that, you brought up a really good point of these oligarchs. You know, right now, the people in Russia are going to be strangled, essentially, by some of these economic sanctions. Nola, I'd love to get your perspective, because we're seeing reports that Putin is going to put a lot more mercenaries on the ground in Ukraine. These are folks who are paid. We've already talked about the disparate treatment in some of the soldiers in his own army that were clearly ill-equipped to take Ukraine. So I'm curious, as the people of Russia suffer from these sanctions, will that create more of a pipeline for him to be able to pay people and hire people to, you know, go and fight for money instead of fighting for some ideological reason?
That's a very good question. I think that the two go hand in hand. I don't think that you can take the ideology part has to be there to some degree, right? So I think that in terms of incentivizing people to go and fight in Ukraine, I think that that's a good incentive. Not saying I agree with it. I'm saying that it is an incentive. In terms of the sanctions, I've been saying all along that absolutely they are going to feel the pinch of the sanctions. And I think one more thing that's important to bring up is I've been paying attention to Putin's securitizing language, and it seems to me is that he is just looking for a reason to materially escalate. He is just inching and inching for anything to happen. His threats are bombastic, yes, but because his threats, we can't tell if they're credible or not, but the one thing that we can rely on is that we can't trust what he's saying. So we have to go by what he's done already. And like you said, he's already advanced an illegal war in Ukraine. What won't he do next? So it seems like to me, he's just looking for a reason. And
he is in a legal war and has a nuclear power plant operating under his control with the staff there operating at gunpoint. Quite scary. Sorry to cut you off there, Nola. We are up against a hard break and way out of time. I want to thank you, Nola Haynes, Malcolm Nance, and Jason Johnson for a very, very busy hour on the Cross Connection. Stay with us, though. We'll be right back.